Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad that you are able to join us today for this co-sponsored webinar with Institute of the Sustainable Future at Purdue University and the Hoosier Environmental Council. My name is Lynn Dahman. I am the Senior Managing Director at ISF, and this is one of several webinars that we have in our planning for early 2025 on implications of PFAS chemicals. I am going to hand it over to Maria Iterbay-Jang from Hoosier Environmental Council to introduce you to the webinar from their side.
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning, everybody. It's an honor to have you here for this interesting webinar. I will give you a brief overview of our speakers. So we will begin an introduction to PFAS, what they are, how they are used, and where they are found. For this, we are honored to have Dr. Marisol Sepúlveda from Purdue University. She will guide us through this foundational understanding. Next, we will shift to the health implications of PFAS exposure, led by Dr. Jennifer Freeman, also from Purdue University. Dr. Freeman's work in human health will provide critical insights into how PFAS affect our well-being. We will then hear about Indiana's experience with PFAS as Professor Ty Hoskins from Purdue University presents findings from the Purdue Statewide assessment of PFAS. This presentation will give us a snapshot of where PFAS are being detected and what it means for our communities. After that, we will turn our attention to policy and legal impacts of PFAS at the federal level. We are honored to welcome Hannah Nelson from the Southern Environmental Law Center, who will walk us through the evolving regulatory landscape and what it could mean for local and state level action. Finally, we will open a Q&A facilitated discussion led by Sam Carpenter, Executive Director of Hoosier Environmental Council. This is a chance to ask questions, share insights, and deepen our understanding. So Sam, the floor is yours for your housekeeping notes.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And we appreciate everybody participating. And we really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the Purdue's Institute for a Sustainable Future to host this webinar today. A few things that I'm going to say is go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A as we go, and our different panelists will be answering throughout the presentation, but we will all have some time at the end as well for to read out some of your questions that haven't been answered yet. I am going to drop a webinar survey into the chat later in the session, so please keep your eye open for that. And we will really appreciate having your input. And then last, we are planning another webinar later in January, and so we'll post a notice about that, January 21st. So save the date. PFAS is a big, important issue, obviously nationally, but for our state in Indiana. We know that we're going to be having some questions about that at the upcoming legislative session. So in January, we'll get into that more. But thank you for that. And now I want to go ahead and turn it over for an introduction by Dr. Maria Sepúlveda from Purdue. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. You can see my screen as well?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your time this morning. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about just a very brief introduction about what these compounds are, where they came from, how do we define them, and a little bit about uses and sources of exposure. So it's interesting to note here as a starting point that the definition of PFAS is actually an evolving thing. So there's really not a universally accepted definition of PFAS, and this is important when we think about regulatory bodies that are involved when they're making their decisions and how they define these chemicals. But in general terms, these are man-made chemicals that have very unique properties. They're resistant to heat, and they both repel water and oil at the same time. They are formed by this chain of carbons. So you see on this picture, there are 8 of them. They're those gray dark balls that you see in the picture. They're all bonded to a carbon. These fluorine atoms are bonded, and shown in green, are bonded to the carbon atoms, making a the strongest bond in nature, basically. That's why it's so hard to get rid of them and break them down in the environment. The most studied PFAS are PFOA, or perfluorooctanoic acid, as you probably have heard about, and also PFOS, or perfluorooctane sulfonate. The one shown here on the picture is PFOA, and you can see that it has a long chain, right? That's formed. I'm trying to cross this screen. I don't want to see myself here. Sorry. Anyways, they are formed by these long chains that are very stable, and they also have a functional head or group. So in this case, in PFOA, it has a hydrogen group at the end that makes it an acid, so it dissolves in water once it gets to the water. And in case of PFOS, it has a sulfonate group, which makes it even more stable and potentially more toxic compared to PFOA. So where did these compounds come from? Well, they were synthesized. Teflon was synthesized by mistake, actually, I learned, by Dr. Roy Plunkett from DuPont in 1938. So that's when the first compounds, 3M was also a major company that created them. And so the manufacturing and the commercial production of these compounds began in the 50s and until today. And they have been involved in a very large number of different types of industries, from medical, aerospace, construction, automotive, military, etc. Now, in around the 70s, some health concerns began, mostly occupational exposures that were very high to things like PFOA, leading to cancers. But then as time progressed, much more sublethal, not such severe types of effects, as we're going to hear from Dr. Freeman in a few minutes, became more apparent. And most now what we talk about are very subtle things like changes in lipid metabolism or things like that we're going to hear more about, as I said. They also have been phased out, some of them like PFOS and PFOA from a lot of the products, at least in this country. And also in the last 20 years or so, there's been a very high level development, high-paced development of technology to detect them at very, very low levels in the environment. This is a very large group of a family that is a very large. Okay, so we have different classes shown here in orange. So in general terms, we have the non-polymers and the polymers. From the environmental side of things and the health aspects, we're mostly interested in the non-polymers. And here in this class of PFAS, we find most of the chemicals that we have studied, that we hear about in terms of their potential effects, and so forth. We do have polymers too, which are a big group. And as I'm going to mention in a couple of slides coming up, they might not be per se able to cross membranes and enter bodies or animals or plants, but they are sources of PFAS that can be toxic and can be taken up by organisms. If we blow up this even more, you see that there's hundreds of different, well, not hundreds in this picture, but there's really thousands of different PFASs out there right now. Around 15,000 is what the EPA has estimated. So the important thing here too to denote is that some of them are precursors, so they might not be the final terminal product that we think about like PFOS, but they might be an intermediate product that basically turns or transforms into this very persistent types of PFAS. So this diagram here kind of summarizes, it's like the tip of the iceberg, basically, is what we're dealing with, although the iceberg here is sort of shown like on the top. We see all the precursors, the major sources, right? Bringing all these different types of PFASs that then start to change in the environment because of bacteria and other things. They start to transform. And ultimately, what we see is out of these 15,000 that I mentioned earlier, we end up with a group that we think are important as a society to look at, which is less than 0.5% of the total universe of them. 29 is what the US EPA methods measure in drinking water. We have a list that goes up to 60 or 70 in some cases, but it's still a very small fraction of the total. Now, if we think about what happens or where these chemicals are coming from mostly, one of the major sources are industry, right? And that's shown here on this diagram here to your left. You see all the industry that produces them can release some of these chemicals directly to the environment, whether it's water or air. We also have a lot of industrial sources coming or being deposited as landfill, and those can leak effluents or PFAS into the environment as well. They're taken up by plants. One of the things that we are going to hear more about by Dr. Hoskins in a little bit is that in our state, there's a big critical potential source of PFAS right now, which is biosolids, which are sludges that are basically consolidated in sewage wastewater treatment plants that could be coming from industry or households. And that then gets basically aggregated and concentrated into a sludge that then gets applied in crops. And this is important for us in the state because we have a lot of biosolid application, and we believe as scientists, as researchers in this area, this is one of the major sources of PFAS right now to our environment. There's also a lot of things that lead to exposure currently. So exposure is almost, it's impossible to avoid because we have these chemicals in many products that we use on a daily basis, like cookware and clothing and food packaging. But ultimately, the main two sources of exposure for people, for humans, are drinking water and food consumption currently. But again, there's multiple other sources. A lot of it is indoor air, indoor dust that people are inhaling as well, or eating, especially children. So the last slide that I want to talk a little bit about here is bioaccumulation. We hear a lot about this word. What is bioaccumulation? Bioaccumulation means that an organism, whether it's a plant, it could be a vertebrate animal, it could be an invertebrate animal, basically takes up these chemicals different ways, could be oral, like I said earlier, and then it starts to accumulate these chemicals in their bodies. They bind to the proteins and they stay in things like liver, kidney, brain. They move to the brain, they move to different organs, and they stay there for a long time, especially in people. And it's because we cannot degrade them fast enough. Ultimately, we will get rid of them, but it will take us years in the case of PFOS, for example. The interesting thing about bioaccumulation is that in plants, most of the shorter chain PFASs are the ones that are taken up by plants because they're more water soluble, where in animals, it's the opposite. The longer chain ones tend to stay a lot longer in our bodies, like PFOS, C8s, like those kinds of compounds. So I'm going to finish up with my last slide, give you four main take-homes, if you will. The first one is that the definition of PFAS is evolving. It's not fixed. It's something dynamic that changes. We have the EPA has a definition that's different, for instance, than what the European use, just to give you an idea. This is a very large group of contaminants, the largest that we've ever had. If we compare it to other chlorinated pesticides or biphenyls or other types of chemicals that have been with us for many decades, those are very small, families of chemicals compared to PFAS. There's multiple sources, and exposure to these chemicals is very likely, and only some of them, not all of them, bioaccumulate. So with that, I hope I didn't run out of my time. I'm going to pass it down to Janet, or maybe Sam will. I don't know.
No, well, thank you for that. And Dr. Sepúlveda, please check out the Q&A as there are a lot of questions came in. I guess one question I have for you, if you don't mind answering briefly, is the number of PFAS that have actually are being studied and regulated by the EPA and the drinking water standards versus the number that is out there. So how much is that covered through the EPA standards in terms of the thousands of types of PFAS that compounds that are out there?
That's a very important question, because that's exactly what the problem is, right? We don't know how to manage, how to regulate such a large group of compounds, because they're not the same. It's not like we can add them together and sum them up and say, oh, that's what your toxicity is going to be, because they all have different types of toxicity. Some of them are more toxic than others, etc. So it's very difficult to determine which others we should be focusing on right now. So I think that let's say 60 is our universe right now. That's not sufficient, I think, to capture the large variety of chemistry that's present. So we need to, as scientists, determine out of those 1,500, how many more do we need to really pay attention to? And that's a very dynamic field of research right now. And I think there's papers coming out trying to figure out ways to group them and reclassify them to some degree to decrease the number of potential things we have to test. But that's still very, there's not really a one answer to your question, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your presentation. And so we can make sure everyone has time, we'll go to Dr. Freeman to share some about the health implications.
All right, thank you. And you hear me okay and see my screen okay?
You're perfect. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to talk to you about the health implications and some of the different actions that we can take to try and reduce our exposure to PFAS. So often our health implication story starts in the area of the Washington Works DuPont plant in West Virginia. At this plant, they were producing Teflon and began in the 1940s. And throughout, there were no regulations at that point in time for regulating these emissions as they were producing the chemical and working with this chemical. And we started to see several years later several stories that came to light in this community. One was on a farm located in this community where a farmer started to report having major ill effects occurring in his cattle population, and those cows starting to die and pass away. Several of them had severe developmental malformations. And we also started to hear a couple stories from individuals who had worked at the plant. And this photo shown here at the bottom is one particular family where the mother had worked at the plant while she was pregnant. And unfortunately, there was some effects that were seen from that pregnancy, and questions started to arise. Now, Teflon is one of our PFAS chemicals. It's PFOA that Marisol had mentioned with our carbon 8 chain. What happened through this story, and kind of fast forward through it, is that we started to see litigation arise from these exposures and in this question that was happening. And at the end of the litigation, what happened is that we saw one of the most significant environmental epidemiology studies that were conducted in this community. This was called the C8 Science Panel. So it got its name because it was based on PFOA exposure at that DuPont plant. And PFOA is one of our carbon 8 PFAS that we have. So this study included over 69,000 people. They were over 18 years of age. And one of the most significant findings from this study is that this population had a blood level of PFOA that was 5 times that of the US population. From this environmental epidemiological study, they were able to start to nail down and identify what specific adverse health outcomes were going to be associated with this elevated level of PFOA exposure. And so in this diagram, it shows some of those key adverse health effects that were detected in this population from, again, just a single PFAS of PFOA. These included high cholesterol, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, pregnancy-induced hypertension, testicular cancer, and kidney cancer. And we started to see this information about the PFAS start to come into more of the public eye. A lot of different newspapers were starting to run stories about the effects that were being seen in the findings from this study. And most recently, if you haven't had a chance to see this and where this outlining this study, there's a movie that came out in 2019 called Dark Waters, where they really walk through the details of this case and the findings and what happened in this community. So this study was really setting the stage for us to start to look into these different PFAS compounds and try to understand what adverse health outcomes we might see from exposure. And to date, what we have seen is that the two most well-studied PFAS of the thousands that are in the pool include PFOA, the one that I was discussing before, the carbon 8 chain one, but also PFAS or PFOS. This was also a carbon 8 chain. And from these studies, what they have concluded for adverse health outcomes include that increased cholesterol level risk, increased cancer risk, and those certain ones that I mentioned earlier, altered metabolism, reduced immune system function and vaccine response, and increased thyroid disease. Now, these outcomes were seen in those sexes, and that's one of the things that we like to pinpoint and investigate in these studies is trying to understand whether or not we might see sex-specific outcomes. And there were a few that were identified, with females also showing an increased risk of diabetes, some interference with our body's natural hormones and our endocrine system, and then some effects during pregnancy, lower chance of getting pregnant, increased blood pressure and preeclampsia in pregnant women, and then also during pregnancy, an increased risk for reduction in fetal growth. Studies have also continued to look during one of the most vulnerable stages of our life, during development, and have reported an increased risk of childhood obesity and also growing learning and behavioral issues in children with a higher level of PFAS exposure, primarily PFAS or PFOA. But one of the challenges that we have in this area, and as Marisol was mentioning, is that these are only two of the thousands of PFAS chemicals that are in production today. And we have additional concerns and a lot of questions on whether or not what type of adverse health outcomes we will see in all these other related PFAS compounds. And so there's a lot of additional studies that are being completed to try and answer these questions. Additional challenges that we face and some of the significance of the PFAS exposure is that we do have those multiple sources of exposure that Marisol had mentioned. This complicates trying to tease out where our exposures might be coming from. It is reported that almost 100% of the U.S. population is exposed to at least one PFAS. There have been blood studies completed to determine how much PFAS is in the U.S. population. And there's also the question about this increasing body burden of PFAS as we age. So as we get older, the amount of PFAS that we have in our bodies continues to increase. But I did want to spend a few minutes just to share some of the actions and some of the different practices that we as consumers and individuals can also make in trying to reduce our PFAS exposure. I often get that question a lot in trying to just realize what kind of control or what are my choices that I have out here with the PFAS exposure. So one program that was highly successful was the PFOA Stewardship Program. This program was developed in the early 2000s with the goal of eliminating emissions in products with PFOA and PFAS, our 8 carbon chain length PFAS, and also any of the PFAS that had a higher carbon number by 2015. So this was any of our PFAS that had carbon chain length of 8 or above. And what we saw was a great vast reduction, specifically in PFOA and PFAS, to those 8 carbon chain length, a reduction of 60% in PFOA and a reduction in 80% in PFAS in human blood levels when we're looking over that time span of 1999 to 2014 during that PFOA stewardship program. In addition, earlier this year, the US EPA came out with their first drinking water standards for PFAS in our water, since water is one of our major exposure routes. We see PFAS regulations for 6 different PFAS. Those regulatory levels are mentioned here in this table. These include the ones that I've mentioned before, PFOA and PFAS, the 8 carbon chain length. These are both set at 4 parts per trillion. And I'll mention in a few minutes kind of what is parts per trillion and what does that number kind of look like. But the goal, I did want to mention the goal of PFOA and PFAS based upon health facts is we really want no PFOA or PFAS in our drinking water. But the goal is hopefully that they can regulate that at less than 4 parts per trillion. In addition, regulations include a 9 carbon chain PFAS called PFNA, a 6 carbon chain length PFAS called PFHXS, and another 6-carbon called Gen X. So PFHXS and Gen X were both replacements for PFOA and PFAS, working to get shorter carbon chain lengths. Those 3 are each regulated at a level of 10 parts per trillion in our drinking water. And then the final regulation is looking at the idea that it's likely if you're going to find one PFAS in your water, you might find a couple of them. And so there's a regulatory level for a mixture of 2 or more if you find that 9-carbon PFNA, the 6-carbon PFHXS, the other 6-carbon Gen X, but also includes a 4-carbon PFAS called PFBS, which is also a replacement for PFOS or PFAS. This regulatory level is 1 unitless hazard index, and it's, again, just trying to identify the idea that we might find these in a mixture and realizing their cumulative adverse health impacts that might be associated with exposure. Now, 1 part per trillion and 4 part per trillion, what does that mean? It's really a very, very small number. It's often hard to visualize. So often people have come up with this visualization that if you can think about 4 parts per trillion, it's a nanogram per liter amount that we measure in our solutions. It would be a single drop in 5 Olympic swimming pools. That's how small of an amount that 4 parts per trillion is. And so it is one of those challenges that we face when we're trying to regulate and measure at these very small concentrations. Another comparison that I wanted to share is some people say 4 parts per trillion would be equal to 4 square feet of floor tile on a floor the size of Indiana. So again, just indicating this how small this measurement is and these regulatory levels that have been set. And I will mention that most of the regulatory levels in our drinking water will be at the parts per billion or parts per million level, so 10 times or 100 times above what we'd be detecting for the PFAS. And that just shows the significance of being able to figure out whether or not there is PFAS in our drinking water as a source. In addition, PFAS are found in a number of our consumer products, and there are actions that we can take as consumers to limit and reduce our exposure to PFAS. We can choose PFAS-free consumer products, such as our personal care products, are looking at our nonstick pans and the pans that we use for cooking. We can avoid fabrics and coatings that are stain or water resistant, and we can consume less fast food and microwave popcorn because PFAS are often used for coating the paper and the boxes that we find for our fast food products and our microwave popcorn. There are products now that are using PFAS-free labels. I've included here an example of a few labels that you might see. The first one is the most inclusive label where it says PFAS-free with our PFAS, indicating that there are no PFAS at all in the product. But you could also see labels that say PFOA-free or PFOS-free, and I just hedge caution if you see those, because those are only indicating that it doesn't include that single PFAS, but there's likely to have other PFAS that are in there. So ideally, you want to choose the labels if you're looking to eliminate and reduce your exposure that say PFAS-free. I've also included on the web on this slide a couple of websites that as consumers we can go, we can look, we can see which products and investigate a little bit on our own about which of these products are PFAS free and which companies are really working towards that way to create these products. And so by choosing these products, we can have an impact overall on what type of products are available to us if we're looking to eliminate or reduce our exposure overall to PFAS because of these health implications that have been indicated with exposure to them. So I will wrap up there and thank you for allowing me to share this information.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. One quick question. Is there a simple, like a carbon type filter for our water system that reduces any level of PFAS that people can implement at home?
Yes, so there are different filtration systems that are available to consumers, including some that you can purchase from Amazon and other suppliers. Just you can look for those, do a Google search, or even go on Amazon to look for those filters to help and really control that exposure level for yourself within your homes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for all the questions coming into the Q&A. You can see a lot of those are being answered. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Tyler Hoskins. And part of this whole presentation got started because Purdue has been developing a report on PFAS. So he's going to share some about that. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, let me get my presentation up here. How about now? Can you see slides?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here and tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing here at Purdue with collaborators from around the state to put together this first Indiana PFAS assessment. And I want to tell you just kind of a broad overview of what that is today. Before I really get into that, I kind of wanted to start with just the idea that all Hoosiers are stakeholders in this issue. I think that's really important to think about. And I wanted to start with a personal example because this is personal to me. So I am a lifelong Hoosier. I grew up on the northeast side of Indianapolis, running around in the woods and hunting and fishing. And that's how I fell in love with the outdoors and environmental science. I had the privilege to attend Butler, get a biology degree, got fascinated by ecotoxicology. So I went and got my PhD to learn how to study chemicals. And now I'm back in my home state at my land grant institution. I'm still out there fishing with my buddies. I get the opportunity to research PFAS and other chemicals and teach about these things too. But more importantly, pass these traditions on to the next generation. And I think that's just something that I want to mention up front, that's kind of what this is all about when I think about these issues. This report, I think, has been called a Purdue PFAS report, but what I really want to emphasize is that this is a collaborative effort and that that's ongoing. So we're not quite finished at the time of this webinar. We've had a lot of contributors from Purdue, Notre Dame, IU. We've had a lot of support from the Department of Environmental Management, and then a bunch of other entities that I've not been able to list here, but across sectors from academia to government and nonprofit. The idea here was to incorporate diverse expertise from a lot of perspectives. One of the things I want to emphasize is that Indiana has a lot of amazing people in this space, and we're really ready to meet these challenges if we can take sensible, concerted action. And I also want to make a note up front here that one sector that you see missing from my list there is industry. They have a very important role in this conversation, and they have a seat at the table. They've not been a part of this report. And I think that's part of a larger problem that I'll highlight later on, and something that we need to work on as a state. But the goals of this report really are to provide an overview of the state of knowledge and a concise assessment of current patterns and potential impacts of PFAS in our state. There's a lot of great PFAS summaries out there. If you just Google, you can find really nice sort of state of the science summaries for these things. But what we really wanted to do here is make it about Indiana per se, and write this for just a basic audience with any sort of basic literacy. And so to highlight, it's not just a statement of facts. What we did is we leveraged all these experts that we pulled together, and we interpreted the available data to identify hazards and data gaps that we felt were most relevant in Indiana, most specifically. And so ultimately what we're trying to do here is provide access to resources, people, and organizations to connect any stakeholder in this issue to the information that they need, whether that be through a person, a report, or an organization somewhere. So today I'm going to provide an overview of this report, basically what we assessed, and highlight just a few key findings. I'm going to have QR codes throughout this thing. The report will be posted here on the ISF website in early 2025. I'm not going to go into a bunch of granular detail in this talk today. We're going to have a lot more detailed information available in the January webinar that Hoosier Environmental Council is going to host, and also in the full report, which we expect to be done in 2025, early 2025. And so with respect to that, the report has not yet been reviewed by all of my contributors or any outside parties. That's in progress right now, and that's a really important part of this. And so because there is interpretation here, I just wanted to make a disclaimer here that the interpretations you're going to see in my presentation here don't represent anybody else's views. These are my interpretations of the report as it stands. The reason I want to point that out is that identical data can lead to very different interpretations depending on where you stand on an issue. So I'll give kind of a silly example here that's maybe a little bit humorous as well. I don't know how many of you remember the 2015 dress incident when America lost its mind over what color this dress was. But we were all looking at the same photograph here, and everybody was seeing either black and blue or white and gold and arguing about it. And if we can look at something as simple as address and come up with a way to argue over that, you can imagine that with a more complex issue like PFAS, you're going to run into a variety of viewpoints. And that's just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about these things. Stakeholders are going to bring different views to the table. So in terms of getting into the assessment itself, I want to cover what we covered here. So you already heard a lot about PFAS sources and the PFAS cycle from Marisol earlier. She did a great job with that. I'll try to talk a little bit about exposure pathways for humans and wildlife, and also pathways that are especially relevant in Indiana, and where to find Indiana exposure data. Jennifer just did a great job with human health hazards, so I'm going to skip over that, although it's part of the report. I will briefly touch on ecological hazards, spend a little bit of time talking about mitigation and destruction from a technological cost perspective, and introduce an idea called the essential use paradigm, which I find to be quite useful in framing this whole situation. There were some other specialized topics that I'm not going to have time to get into today, which I'm listing here, but I'll circle back at the end with some ideas on paths forward. So going from there, I do want to start a little bit with sources and pathways specific to Indiana. And as Marisol mentioned, ultimately PFAS come from fluorochemical manufacturers, right? They have to be produced somewhere. And historically in the US, this has been 3M, DuPont, and their subsidiary companies. And then there are a lot of overseas companies that also produce PFAS. One thing we highlight in the report is that fluorochemical production plants are absent in Indiana. We don't have those, like you might have heard of the problems on the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, for example. Those are coming from a fluorochemical production plant. We don't have those here. What we do have are a lot of PFAS using industries. And not only that, but PFAS using industries that tend to be pretty important to us in terms of economic impact. So I wanted to highlight some of those here. The pharmaceutical and medical industries currently require PFAS to provide the products and services that they do, and those are huge economic drivers in our state. Construction and wood and paper production you heard about earlier. I wanted to highlight especially semiconductor production. There's a concerted effort to increase that here in Indiana. You can think about efforts like the hard tech corridor that we're building between Indianapolis and Lafayette to fuel demand for high performance computing and artificial intelligence and these things that we're thinking about. But all of this requires PFAS. And then, of course, Indiana is a highly agricultural state. And I wanted to talk about PFAS getting into agricultural areas through pesticides, which can contain PFAS in some cases, but also through land-applied biosolids. So I'm going to highlight this one for a minute. Land-applied biosolids are quite common in Indiana. So Marisol briefly mentioned this, but these are basically the solid wastes that are produced at wastewater facilities receiving waste from either municipal or industrial sources. And there's a variety of ways that these things get dealt with, but there's a lot. So 200,000 dry tons produced in Indiana based on this data. And you can see a large proportion of that then gets treated and added to soils to support agriculture. And historically, that's been a really kind of well-intentioned and great idea. It's a cheap source of fertilizer. It's a way to recycle this waste rather than landfilling it or burning it. And it adds nitrogen and phosphorus to the soils in ways that increase crop production. But the concerns here come from the fact that we know that these solids contain PFAS. And so when the treatment processes to prepare them for land application don't remove them. So they do end up in the biosolid amended soils. And so you can start to imagine some of the concerns here. And all of these, I want to point out, are very active areas of research. And there's varying degrees of issues associated with each of these, which I'm not going to have time to go into detail about, but I did want to mention that. So maybe most obviously are the crops that we're growing on these soils taking PFAS up. In particular, soybean and corn are very important crops in this state, so that's a very active area of research right now. PFAS can run off of these biosolid amended soils into streams, rivers, ponds, and lakes. And then because they are bioaccumulative, they can be taken up by the biota that live there. And so we can start to think about exposed wildlife, maybe culturally important wildlife. This is perhaps showing my bias a little bit, but as somebody who grew up hunting and fishing, I'm really concerned about fish and deer and waterfowl and turkey that are perhaps drinking from these waters or eating off of these contaminated fields, whether they're getting exposures, and then whether hunters and anglers are getting those exposures in turn. And obviously livestock becomes another concern here. And then independent of this sort of surface water pathway, PFAS can leach into groundwater. Again, this is a super active area of research, including here at Purdue. But some PFAS can get into well water, and that can be problematic. The ultimate concern here is, are there hazards for wildlife or people that are exposed through these routes? And I find it interesting that here it's our rural populations that are of particular concern, and thought this was a good moment to point out that in this report, we do discuss other potentially vulnerable populations, because not all people are going to be exposed to equal amounts of PFAS depending on their lifestyle. I also wanted to highlight that Indiana exposure data is available. So of course, as a scientist, I'm always going to be screaming more in terms of monitoring, and I do think we need to put more resources towards that. But the Indiana Department of Environmental Management has really been leading the charge on monitoring programs in our state. And so we are lucky to have baseline data specific to Indiana. They've measured PFAS in public drinking water supplies across the state. In this report, we've taken that data and we've mapped it by county according to these maximum contaminant levels that have been mandated by the US EPA. I'm not going to show that data today, but it'll be available soon. I also wanted to point out here that their jurisdiction on this is public drinking water supplies, by my understanding. And so private wells are usually the responsibilities of their owners. So if there are callers on here today that have wells, know that it might be your responsibility to get your well tested. IDEM has also monitored surface water, which is really important from an ecological perspective. Also concentrations in fish as they apply to fish advisories. And so you can go to IDEM's website and see a lot of this data. But it's not been just IDEM. There have been nonprofit and federal groups providing data that can be useful in our state. So the Environmental Working Group website has some nice interactive maps and downloadable data, as does the US EPA and the United States Geological Survey. And so I'll be providing links to these things in the slides that I'll provide after this and in the report itself. Jumping over to ecology, I'm going to kind of throw my hands up in the air and say that we really don't understand the ecological impacts of PFAS yet. There just is not enough data to answer this question, but it is a highly active research area. We try to highlight in the report where this research is happening so that people that are concerned can reach out to those researchers. A couple of things that we do know from the available data, though. We know that Hoosier gamefish and other species bioaccumulate PFAS. So studies in the Great Lakes have shown that pretty economically and recreationally important species like brown trout, rainbow trout, lake trout, and Chinook salmon are bioaccumulating PFAS. Work here at Purdue is indicating that largemouth bass and bluegill in places like farm ponds are bioaccumulating PFAS. And then we've also spent a lot of time here looking at amphibians, and indeed they do as well. So that's more from a bioaccumulation perspective, but from a effects perspective, we also know that native wildlife can be negatively affected. So I'm just going to shamelessly show you one small example from one of my own studies here, where we took leopard frog tadpoles and we exposed them either to no PFAS or a mixture of PFAS that would be seen at a place that's receiving runoff. And what we saw in this study is if they were exposed, they tended to be about 20% smaller in terms of body mass at metamorphosis, which has fitness effects on those animals. So in general, the jury's out, but we do know that there can be harm to native wildlife. From a mitigation and harm reduction standpoint, we've heard a lot already, and I've seen a lot of questions in the chat about PFAS filtration from drinking water. The good news here is that if you're concerned about PFAS in your drinking water, current technologies can help. So in the report, we're going to provide links with some specific recommendations about the types of systems and pros and cons of each. They tend to fall into a couple categories like activated carbon, reverse osmosis, and ion exchange. These can actually do a pretty good job on like a household scale, which is good news. It's also an active area of research. People are always working on making these filters better. Where the challenge comes in is sort of at larger scales, like if we start thinking about municipal water operations having to deal with larger volumes of water. This does become quickly difficult and more expensive, and it's a kind of pressing challenge is one of the things I wanted to highlight here. So the EPA drinking water regulations that you've heard mentioned become enforceable in 2029. So within about 4 years, we're going to have to comply with these things. And these are national estimates, not for Indiana specifically, but the initial cost to build this infrastructure has been estimated by EPA at about $15 billion. And then maintenance after that is $1 billion. And then that doesn't take into account what we're going to do with the waste that is produced from these filtration processes. And that is sort of an area of mixed news, in my opinion. So my understanding of this situation is that there are currently no feasible solutions for destruction or disposal of PFAS waste at scale to deal with the scale of this sort of problem that I'm talking about here. However, this is a really, really rapidly evolving field. I see papers coming out on this every day. Our engineers are working really, really hard. So while technology might not be able to save us quite yet, it may be able to soon, and we really need to prioritize that kind of research if we care about that. And again, we've got people here in Indiana doing that. So these things are called forever chemicals for good reason, and that's because until production stops, exposures will continue. So to ultimately solve this problem, we have to eliminate the use of PFAS. And Jennifer showed a really nice example from the NHANES study where when we do reduce the exposure, say for PFOA, levels in humans and wildlife decrease. So this is not like a panic and there's no hope situation. We can do this. We know how. We just have to spend the money and do it. The problem is that it's tricky. PFAS have become really ubiquitous, and we can't eliminate production without serious unintended consequences. So the example I like to talk about here is that PFAS are used in life-saving medical equipment, right? So for example, there are PFAS containing heart valves where PFAS are applied to avoid plaque formation, from what I understand, right? And so if you imagine sort of a risk assessment around somebody who needs a heart valve replacement or at the population level, right? We could decide that we're not going to allow these valves to be replaced. You're going to see big increases in death from heart disease and no PFAS hazard. The alternative to that is let them produce the valves. You're going to decrease deaths from heart disease. And you're going to introduce what I would argue is a fairly small PFAS hazard, right? That's going to be a small volume, small release sort of scenario. So most would agree that the benefits of heart valves might outweigh the risks of small volumes of PFAS produced and released in association with that. But for example, at the other extreme, PFAS on food contact materials, we might judge that differently, right? And so that's where things become really challenging because these PFAS are used for so many different things. We have to start deciding where we're going to use them and where we're not. And stakeholder views, as I alluded to earlier, are going to vary. People are not going to agree on what's tolerable and what's not with respect to risks. That depends on the perspective that you're bringing to this. So for example, if you're an industry whose entire business model currently depends on PFAS, you're necessarily going to have a different view than a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to reduce impacts of PFAS in the environment, say, right? And so there's going to be conflict. That's unavoidable in this type of situation, but it does not have to become adversarial. An adversarial approach will slow progress on this. What we really need is for all stakeholders that have concern to recognize that all of these perspectives are valid, try to come together and come up with a solution. And so that might sound like a pie in the sky, like how are we ever going to do that sort of thing? But there's some really good thinking out there on how to do this, but it's going to be very different from ways we've approached chemical regulation in the past. One really interesting idea here is the essential use paradigm, right? So basically, in its simplest form, instead of regulating these chemicals chemical by chemical or grouping them into groups of chemicals by functionality or something like that, this goes use by use. How are we using this PFAS? What is it used for, right? A heart valve versus food contact material. It weighs the hazards versus the benefits in the short term, while in the long term working to reduce, reuse, replace, and ultimately eliminate PFAS. So, you first think about eliminating non-essential uses when there are functional alternatives already in existence. And then when those functional alternatives aren't there, you invest in research for technologies to replace them with better things. This is a way to be pragmatic and to bring all stakeholders to the table. And there are some really nice frameworks out there, which we really try to highlight in this report. But again, this is not a conventional approach to risk assessment, and it would take some pushing to get people to adopt this. So what's the path forward? I mean, I'm happy to say that I'm optimistic that we're well positioned to meet the PFAS challenge in this state. We have a lot of experts working across multiple sectors in this space. I think the attendance of this webinar demonstrates that in some way. From an academic perspective, though, a lot of us are having to chase federal grants around and work outside the state. What would be really awesome is if we could fund Indiana experts to tackle challenges in Indiana directly. And I think legislation is really the only way to do this. I think we need more and open cooperation across sectors. That's going to speed progress, again, avoiding that adversarial approach. And again, I'd encourage people to look into this essential use paradigm as a way forward on this. Education, like what we're doing with this report and what other groups are doing with their networks, are really important to empower Hoosiers to reduce exposure through knowledge. We have to remember that 50% of Americans have never heard of PFAS. And even groups like physicians are often not familiar with these chemicals. And so when they're approached, they're not sure what to do sometimes. So we need to do better with education. And really, we need a strategic roadmap. So what are the problems? Who's best positioned to tackle them? And how are we going to fund that? And also an action plan, which is more of a group that would be able to rapidly respond to more pressing situations, which do exist in this state. There are pressing situations that need action now. And so I wanted to end again, kind of where I started. All of us are stakeholders on the issue of PFAS. I want my son to be able to enjoy the same things that I got to enjoy as a kid, and I'm trying to teach him how to do that. But I do worry that if we don't take action, he's not going to inherit the same type of environment that I had the privilege of growing up in. And so I hope this report will help spur PFAS action in our state. I think we've got a great start. This report will help, but we really need to come together, formalize a plan, and then dedicate the resources, including money, that's necessary to execute that plan, and then just leverage the talent that we have here in our state and get after it. So with that, I will be done. This is my contact information, and this QR code here will take you to the ISF webpage here at Purdue, where this report will become available early next year. Thank you. I think you're muted, Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Tyler. It's interesting to hear you talk about we need Indiana solutions for this particular issue. Recently read about our neighbors to the south in Kentucky through legislation developing a committee that's really set to tackle this issue. So that's an interesting idea. It sounds like you think we need to be kind of garner our resources and expertise in that area as well. One person asked about farmers being engaged. Are you familiar with kind of how this issue might be impacting farmers and the level of awareness around it?
So that's not been studied much in Indiana per se. And that's an area that I've actively been trying to get into. And that's again probably showing my biases here about why I wanted to highlight that biosolids route. We do think that's an important one. So PFAS are used in some pesticides that are widely applied in Indiana. And then again, these land applications of biosolids can introduce them to soils. From the available data right now, it seems like plant uptake tends to be the shorter chain PFAS. And often those chemicals, from my understanding, are not going into the fruits themselves, but are going into the silage. So not maybe as scary as at first glance. There's some work here at Purdue looking at rural wells that's led by Linda Lee. I think she has a recent paper out on this here in Tippecanoe County, showing how rural wells have been affected. So we're starting to chip away at that. And then my team's leading research on how these things are running off into ponds and getting into pond food webs that way. Some other states have gotten a little more into this space. I think it's also important to mention that things like just reactively banning biosolids applications would be a horrible idea from where I'm standing. So it's more complex than that. And it requires a thoughtful approach, which is why I think this strategic roadmap would help.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your research. So we've had kind of an introduction to PFAS. We've had some information about health implications, as well as this study focused on Indiana and the assessment. And now we're going to turn to Hannah Nelson, who's a staff attorney with Southern Environmental Law Center, to talk some about federal regulations. Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, of course. Can y'all see my screen and hear me all right?
Yep, perfect.
Great. All right, so like Sam said, my name is Hannah Nelson. I'm an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I'm based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for some context. And today I'm going to talk through a couple of the legal tools that we have to address this PFAS pollution crisis that we've been talking about today. I'm going to start with federal updates, but I do want to give a teaser into some things that our states can be doing now to stop PFAS pollution at the source, which will hopefully address some of the ongoing contamination that we're seeing. I can get this to change. Before we dive into the legal landscape, I want to give a little bit of background on how SELC became experts in fighting PFAS pollution. 7 years ago, folks in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a coastal town in our state, they woke up to this headline, and we all learned that Chemours, a PFAS manufacturer, had been silently contaminating the drinking water for 500,000 North Carolinians, and it had been doing so for decades. The pollution from Chemours sparked SELC's first major PFAS case, and there we represented Cape Fear River Watch, a powerful nonprofit in Wilmington. We ultimately reached a settlement that required Chemours to clean up their site and to achieve 99% reduction in their PFAS air emissions and water pollution. I mention this because we learned a whole heck of a lot through that case. A key lesson being that existing law, like the Clean Water Act, can be used to control PFAS at the source and keep it out of our water altogether. And that's critical because Chemours is not the only source of PFAS in North Carolina, much less the entire country. This is a screenshot from EPA's PFAS analytic tool, and it shows industries that are known or suspected to use PFAS. So as you can see, we've got a whole heck of a lot of pollution that we're going to have to deal with over time. I'll talk a little bit more about the existing tools we have in a second, but first I want to give a preview of some new federal regulation that has come out recently. We've talked about drinking water standards in the past couple presentations, so I'll be brief here, but in April of this year, EPA did release the first ever drinking water standards for PFAS. The standards have two parts: a health-based goal, or MCLG, and an enforceable standard, or MCL. Those enforceable standards are what our drinking water utilities will have to ensure that our drinking water does not violate, and they'll have to report any violations should they occur. These standards are great, but they do have limitations. First, they're subject to legal challenge right now. Drinking water utilities filed a lawsuit in federal court over these standards, opposing them. Next, they won't go into effect immediately. Implementation is going to take place over 5 years, with testing occurring during years 1 and 2, and technology implementation in years 3 through 5. So it's a slow process, should they even survive the legal challenges. Finally, as we've talked about before, these are standards for only 6 PFAS out of the thousands that exist. And we know that many of the other thousands of chemicals hold similar chemical structures and pose similar health risks. So going chemical by chemical is not efficient. And as Dr. Sepúlveda mentioned, it's near impossible to go this route. It's going to take too much time, and our communities are not going to get the protections that they deserve. The responsibility shouldn't fall on downstream communities and downstream water utilities, so it's really important for us to keep these chemicals out at the source. Next tool I want to mention is the hazardous designation of PFOA and PFOS, two notoriously harmful PFAS chemicals. This was a designation under CERCLA, or the Superfund law. This is another huge win at the federal level, and it means that entities responsible for long-term contamination of our environment will bear the cost and the responsibility of the cleanup instead of the communities who are living around contaminated sites. Because PFAS don't break down in our environment due to those really strong bonds, these designations will be integral to addressing past and legacy pollution. And hopefully they will be a proactive tool too. They should encourage industry to be more mindful when they release PFAS into the environment so that they can avoid future liability under this law. I will note that unfortunately, like the drinking water standards, the hazardous substances designations are facing legal challenges too. Industry and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have filed a lawsuit in federal court over this rule as well. The final federal tool that I want to mention is coming down the line. It's not final yet, but EPA has said that it intends to set effluent limitation guidelines, or ELGs, for PFAS manufacturers. These ELGs are national, or will be national wastewater treatment standards, meaning that Clean Water Act permits issued to PFAS manufacturers will have to contain strict controls and really limit the pollution that can come from these facilities. This is, again, a huge step forward. Like we've seen with our work through Chemours, PFAS manufacturers can have devastating impacts on communities downstream, but the rule will only apply to these PFAS manufacturers, not the thousands of industries that use and release the chemicals like we saw on the map earlier. And like Tyler mentioned, in Indiana, we don't have PFAS manufacturers. And so it's really these other industries using them that are the problem. And this rule would not apply to those. These 3 tools, the drinking water standards, the hazardous substances designation, and the ELGs, they're great. And they apply once the pollution is out in the environment. But existing law gives us the tool to prevent the PFAS from getting out in the first place. And because these federal tools are tied up in litigation and they might be subject to possible rollbacks if the Trump administration takes the position it did in its first term, it's all the more important that we turn towards existing tools to make a difference for our communities. On the topic of existing tools, EPA in 2022 issued guidance to all state permitting agencies explaining existing tools that they could use to kind of turn off the tap on PFAS pollution now. These tools include PFAS disclosure requirements. So state agencies could tell companies that they have to inform the agency and the public when they release PFAS, so that when we find it in the environment, we can more readily identify the source and hold them accountable. The second tool was case-by-case technology-based effluent limits. And the third is the pretreatment program. The first is self-explanatory, so I'll spend a little bit more time going through these next few now. Case-by-case technology-based effluent limits, or TBELs, are limits that can be put in Clean Water Act permits based on what the best available technology is. Treatment technology for PFAS in wastewater exists, just like it does for drinking water, and it's highly effective. We've seen it in North Carolina reduce PFAS concentrations from industry as high as like several 100,000 parts per trillion to virtually non-detect. So it's really effective. And permit writers can look at that efficacy and set limits in Clean Water Act permits that require facilities to reduce their pollution to the level that technology can achieve. This process is already a requirement under the Clean Water Act, so it's a tool that state agencies can begin to use now to protect drinking water without having to wait for federal regulations coming down the line. Well, they're super helpful to eliminate PFAS from companies that release wastewater directly into our rivers, but a lot of industry sends their wastewater to municipal wastewater treatment plants. This is where I normally show the graphic that you've now seen twice, showing the different maps, so I hope you'll forgive me for cutting it now. But as you'll remember, these utilities can send it into municipal sewer systems and it ends up in the plant. Luckily, existing law can help us combat that too. Pretreatment authority under the Clean Water Act allows wastewater treatment plants to direct their upstream industrial customers to remove PFAS at the source before sending the wastewater into the city's sewer system. And that's crucial because once the wastewater flows to the utility, it often cannot be removed at the utility level. So anything released into the sewer system either flows through directly into the receiving water or ends up in the biosolids, like a couple of folks have mentioned. That biosolid application then can threaten groundwater and crops on land. The pretreatment program can significantly reduce these routes of PFAS contamination by keeping it out of the sewer system in the first place. This not only helps us address the PFAS concerns, but it puts the burden of PFAS pollution on the industries that are profiting from the use of the chemicals rather than the communities and ratepayers and the utilities themselves. But kind of to close out here, I just wanted to share one key takeaway is that there are multiple legal tools, including some great ones that are coming down from the federal level that will help our communities address the PFAS pollution crisis. But source control is the most efficient and the most cost-effective and equitable solution to addressing PFAS. It can also help us meet these federal regulations that I mentioned. It'll help our drinking water utilities reach the drinking water standards without having to bear the full burden of treatment technology costs. And it can also alleviate concerns over circular liability. It's critical that we use existing tools to achieve these new near-term pollution reductions alongside the federal regulations. Some states have begun to start doing that, and I think that is going to be the most effective route moving forward. I want to save some time for questions, so I will end there and kick it back to you, Sam.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Before we jump into our answering a few more questions through the Q&A, I just want to thank all our panelists for their participation, sharing their expertise today. Thank the Institute for Sustainable Future with Purdue for this partnership and doing this webinar today. We've gotten great interest. I don't know if you all can see, but 130, 140 folks or so participating in the webinar today. And also, I'm going to put a survey into the chat and ask for people to take a moment and give us some feedback there. Now, if that is not showing up for everybody, if there's someone who could put it into the Q&A, I'm not sure. I don't know if everybody has access to the chat or not. But yeah, we would really appreciate your feedback. I do see one hand is raised, and so I'm going to see if we can allow Melissa to ask her question. Melissa, do you have a question that you want to ask? Okay, it might be that is not an intentional hand raise. Okay. A number of questions have been answered in the chat so far. So I just have one or two additional questions. It sounds like there really is, working on this at the preventative level from getting into our system is important. Who's really responsible for protecting us collectively? against PFAS? Where does that lie? Can anybody tackle that one? I like to start with the hard questions first.
We'll kick it off, but I would really welcome other people's thoughts too. It's not fair to ask communities and utilities to bear the burden of these chemicals that private companies are profiting from using. So we have the tools and we have the legal options to keep these chemicals out at the source. Treatment technology can remove them before industries release them into our environment. So I would argue that the responsibility is falling on the companies that are using and profiting from these chemicals.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add to that? Okay.
I would add that ideally that's true. It does get tricky in some situations. I was reading an article last week about a biosolids applicator who is basically lobbying that they should not be held liable for contaminating some soils with PFAS through their biosolids application. So you picture them as kind of a middleman, right? Their business model is to take the recycled biosolids from the wastewater treatment plant, who's following the rules, and then take those and sell them to the farmer and land apply them. And so their argument is, well, yeah, these things are regulated under RCRA and Clean Water Act now, but they weren't, and we weren't aware of that before, so you can't go back in time and sue us now. And so I think that's where it gets murky, is with, these entities that are involved in this PFAS cycle, but did not create the problem in the first place.
Yeah. And interesting, our state attorney general is part of the lawsuit to hold industry accountable of around 24 manufacturing industries that have been involved with PFAS, and to hold those companies accountable for the kind of ill effects that are related with those. We'll do one last question. So we know that PFAS come from this source from manufacturing, but they're also spread. And one of the interesting things we heard, that people that participated in the water summit over the summer heard that there were PFAS found accumulating in the brains of polar bears. How did PFAS get spread that extensively?
I can briefly mention that they do move through the atmosphere. They can move thousands of miles. So there's no place on Earth right now that is free of PFAS. We find them in the Arctic, in the Antarctica. We find them in all the oceans. So yeah, they move far away from where they're released or used through the atmosphere and the ocean, and the waves and all that also helps move in the movement. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay. Well, I feel like we're coming to the end of our time here. I really do appreciate everybody's participation. I also want to call out Maria Itabride, who played an important role in helping to organize and coordinate the session today. So there will be a recording of the session, and you'll receive that in an email. We've gotten your feedback about interest in an upcoming session, and we will be sharing. You'll get a notification of the registration opportunities for that. But with that, we'll close out today. Hope that you found this useful. Please do take just a moment, 5 minutes, to complete the survey we put in the chat, and we'll send that out as a follow-up email as well. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.